The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 3, Writing and Presenting. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to demonstrate planning skills for writing for a specific purpose, audience, and context. Learners should be able to explain the requirements of a familiar range of tasks. This lesson also addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to demonstrate the use of writing strategies and techniques for first drafts. Learners should be able to experiment with format and style for creative purposes, as well as identify and use stylistic and rhetorical devices such as figurative language, word choice, vivid description, personal voice and style, tone, symbol, color, placement, and sound.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. In this last lesson in our series on studying poems, I want to show you how to answer questions in your poetry tests and exams. I would also like to show you some styles of poetry and some poems that might inspire you to write your own poetry. Often, even though you may enjoy poetry, the questions and tasks you have to complete at school seem difficult. A thing that most often causes problems is that learners believe that teachers will not allow them to interpret the meaning of a poem. The belief is that teachers will only accept their own interpretation of a poem. In this lesson, I would like to prove to you that this is not true, provided that your answer is motivated, reasonable, and well phrased. Now let's look at an example of a question. What does the poet imply about his own life in these lines by Ahmad Dangor? Oh, why do you tighten the chains? This question requires you to draw some conclusion about what the idea, the tightening of chains, means to the poet. So you may decide that the idea of chains is symbolically used to mean that the poet is locked up in his house. Then the idea, tighten the chains, may mean that his parents are becoming more and more strict and never let him out of the house at all. Imagine that this is your idea. Now you have to prove it. Let's look for some evidence of your claims in these lines. Look at these words. Why? The repetition here could imply that the poet is begging his parents to act more rationally by questioning what they do. You could also explain that the chains are a metaphor for restrictions and rules imposed by the poet's parents in this line. Tighten the chains. If that is your answer, you could write it down like this. The poet uses a metaphor, comparing his parents' strict rules to the tightening of chains. By repeating the word why, he is emphasizing how difficult he is finding it to accept their rules. If this was your answer, the style and expression of it would be completely acceptable. This is definitely the way to phrase your answer for maximum marks. Remember these points when phrasing your own answers to poetry questions. Use poetic terminology to answer. In other words, use the correct vocabulary to refer to different poetic devices and techniques, such as calling a group of lines from a poem a stanza and not a verse. Provide reasoning and proof for claims, such as quoting lines or words from the poem that provide evidence for what you are saying, and refer to the actual meaning of words. If this poem was about the relationship between parents and their children, your answer would have been correct. But the problem is that this answer only looks at one section of the poem in isolation and does not take the whole poem and its context into consideration. Do you remember this poem from our previous lesson? Oh paradise, cool paradise of Africa, what memories you recreate. Oh why do you tighten the chains? When we look at the poem, we see that it is not at all connected to a relationship between a parent and a child. This is a political poem about Africa. So your answer would look something like this. The poet metaphorically compares living under oppression to tightening chains in the poem. He questions, by repetition of the word why, the justice or lack of justice which is apparent within his society. This answer not only uses evidence, poetic language, and motivations for the claims being made, but it also looks at the poem in context. So, what is our conclusion? Poetry questions must be answered with an awareness of the whole poem and should be responded to in appropriate poetic language. Claims and interpretations must be proven by referral to techniques and to the actual meaning of the poet's words. Here I've summarized the techniques that you should use when answering questions in a poetry test or exam. Consider the meaning of the whole poem. Use poetic language to answer. Provide reasoning and proof for claims. Refer to the actual meaning of words. And refer to poetic techniques in the answer. So now we can move on to some styles of poetry and some poems that might inspire you to write your own poetry. Maybe you would like to try writing your own poetry, but you do not think you have anything important enough to write about. Well, you can write about everyday things, like where you live, the way this poet did in this poem.
Joburg City, you are like death. Joburg City, Johannesburg.
These are the last two lines from a poem by Mongani Wali Sirote. The poem is called City Johannesburg, and it is a very well-known South African poem. I'm sure your teacher can show you a copy of the whole poem. Descriptions can be brought to life by the creative use of figures of speech. Look at this effective simile the poet uses. You are like death. Here, the city is directly compared to death, creating a dramatic image in the reader's mind. This stresses how he finds the city harsh and cruel. He also personifies the city so that he can speak directly to the city. He calls it you. So one subject that might inspire you to write is where you live. Now let's look at some more subjects you might find inspiring. Maybe you feel that you have really good ideas of poems, but they seem to slip out of your head before you have time to act on them. This is a poem written in French by Malik Fall and then translated into English, and it deals exactly with this topic, the fleeting nature of ideas. Empty head. An idea came into my head, so slender, so slight. An idea came fleetingly, fearfully, came to a light. It wheeled about, stretched itself out. An idea came that I wanted to stay, but it brushed my hand and, taking its flight through my fingers, slipped away. This is an intensely personal poem dealing with the poet's internal thoughts and ideas. Maybe you feel that you cannot write poetry because you do not have an extensive vocabulary or you cannot express complicated ideas. Let's look at the poem again. The language is simple and direct, but it describes a universal idea. We've all had ideas which seem quickly to slip away before we come to grips with them. Part of this poem's appeal is that it is written in such a simple language, yet the message is very effectively conveyed. So do not let what you think is a lack of language ability stop you from writing poetry. There can be plenty of beauty in simplicity. You can also use simple ideas to express important statements. In his poem, What Ducks Require, that begins with the line, "Ducks require no ship and sail," John Crow Ransom communicates the serious idea that humans should learn to be satisfied with what they have. He states that ducks, it seems, are perfectly happy without ships or sails, but humans feel that owning things will bring them happiness. Now, if I still haven't convinced you that it is acceptable to write poems in your own style about things that appeal to you, let's look at this poem by an anonymous writer in New York. 30 Purple Birds. Toity poipel boids, sitting on her koib, a toipen and a boypen, and a eating doidy worms. The language in this poem is informal, and it tries to copy in writing the conversation of downtown New Yorkers. It also manages to capture the sound that the birds make, and it has a whimsical quality that makes it sound like a nursery rhyme. So as you can see, you can write an entire poem in spoken language. And as difficult as it is to believe, Shakespeare wrote in the informal language of his time. You will be hard-pressed to believe that this was informal language, but it was. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burnt on the water. So now we've looked at love poetry, protest poetry, fun poetry, and even at some more formal conventional poetry. Out of all of these styles, there should be one that appeals to you. I really hope that you will try and write your own poetry. This brings us to the end of this series on studying poems. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye-bye.